Our keynote speaker this morning is an extraordinary person who I've had the privilege of knowing since the mid-90s. And Linda has been involved in the interface between sort of environment and development issues ever since I met her in the mid-90s. And it's a real privilege and a pleasure to introduce her. And it's a real testimony to her integrity and the contributions that she makes, that she's held executive positions on every side of every debate. So in different industries, in environmental groups and think tanks, she's led them all. And in every time, she's always trying to help people solve problems, these vexing problems that we face. And today she's going to shed some light on what the heck is going on. Linda.
Thanks, Alex, and good to be here with you today. Now, if I just press forward, does it bring up the slide, or you guys will bring up the slide? Okay. So what the heck is going on? I actually came up with this idea of a topic before the events of last week. And I was just planning on following up on what Dave and Dara were presenting and talking a little bit more about, some of the forest and energy outcomes from Brazil. But then last Wednesday saw the release of the independent review of BC's climate plan, the Clean BC plan. And then Thursday saw the announcement of the new MOU between Alberta and Canada. So I thought I'd take a crack. I sort of shifted gears a bit, and I thought what I'd try to do today is outline some of the changes occurring in all three tracks right now. So global, local here in BC with the Clean BC plan, and then nationally with what the Prime Minister is calling our new carbon competitiveness strategy for Canada. But as disruption is the flavor of the day and the theme for your discussions the next two days. Let's get into this by reminding ourselves of some of the mega disruptors that are out there before we dig into climate and energy. So, new U.S. tariffs on Canadian exports has to be at the top of any list of major disruptions occurring in Canada today. The forest industry here in BC is reeling from them with tariffs as high as 45%. It was announced yesterday that 1,000 steel workers in Ontario are going to lose their job in April. And we know that the auto industry in Canada is similarly reeling. And Canada-U.S. trade talks are at a standstill. The future is very uncertain. But this is not the first time that the world has recently had to deal with sudden change that creates major dislocation and risk. There are enormous government deficits and inflation. They weren't the only disruptors that were unleashed by COVID. It can be argued that the other social, political, and health effects from the pandemic still linger on, and they continue to impact what's happening today, and often not in a good way. And then there's war in the Ukraine and in the Middle East, both of which have unleashed new types of technologies that can amplify the scale and the speed of destruction, and both of which have unleashed geopolitical, security, and energy consequences that extend beyond the areas directly involved in the conflict. Meanwhile, climate change continues to upend life in many parts of the world. This is an all too familiar picture of a wildfire in British Columbia, be they fires, droughts, atmospheric rivers, floods like we just saw in Brazil. Climate impacts are hitting harder, they're costing more money, they're directly affecting the lives of millions of people, and they are making recovery and preparedness even more challenging. And finally, no list of mega disruptors would be complete without calling out artificial intelligence, AI for good, AI for bad. No one really knows yet. What we do know for sure is that it is attracting unprecedented unprecedented amounts of money. It will require massive amounts of energy to power and scale. And the quest for global dominance in AI has triggered a no-holds-barred competition between the US and China. So, we are in stormy waters. Lots of churn. No smooth sailing in any direction. It's time for a reset. And resets are happening across the board on different issues around the world. In the time that we have together this morning, I want to call out some of the resets that are occurring on climate and energy strategies that will likely matter to Indigenous communities here in British Columbia. So, as I said, I was only thinking about doing this at the global level, but I've added the local and the national here. So we're going to dig in a little bit deeper and follow up on Dave and Dar's comments on Brazil, what happened there that has particular implications for some of the work that's going on in BC right now. And then locally, we're going to look at some of the recommendations that came out last Wednesday on BC's climate plan. There were some significant changes that were recommended. And then nationally, what is Prime Minister Carney talking about? A new carbon competitiveness strategy. What does it mean? We don't have a lot of info on that yet, but we are seeing a few things emerge. So we'll just look at those quickly. So Brazil, COP30, as Dan has pointed out, in Belém, in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, arguably one of the ground zeros in the world for climate change. So COP, everybody knows here, I'm assuming, forgive me if I'm repeating stuff you guys already know, but it stands for Conference of the Parties. And in this case, the parties are the 195 nations, give or take a few, that have signed on to the UN Convention on Climate Change. And the rationale for international collaboration and cooperation on climate change is that it's obviously not a problem that can be solved at any single one level. We could get rid of GHG emissions entirely in Canada, in British Columbia, in Vancouver, and wouldn't make any difference to the fires and the floods and the other dislocations from, heat extremes that are happening. So that you need to also have cooperation at that global level. Having said that, global cooperation is not a quick or an easy fix. It's really, really hard stuff. So the UN Framework Agreement on Climate Change actually happened, I had to refresh myself on this, in 1992. It was originally signed. But it really took about 23 years before anything significant happened. And that was largely because of an argument or a disagreement at the global level as to whether or not the actions or the recommendations of the agreement would be binding on the countries that signed to it. And so there was a big dispute about that. And finally, they figured out a way forward in Paris in 2015. But for the most part, the answer to the question of whether or not what comes out of the COPs are binding on the countries that have signed the agreement is really not very much. But there's no doubt that the Paris Agreement in 2015, 23 years after the framework was signed, really figured out a new pathway forward. And there were just a couple of things I'll call out that were key in that new pathway that was enshrined in Paris. So you've all heard about the target for 1.5 degrees Celsius. That was agreed there. And also coming out of Paris, maybe after it though, a bit, was the agreement to set a timeline for that target. So 2050 to reach net zero emissions. And also there are conditions that emerged around that target and the timeline. And the conditions basically were that the changes that have to occur need to be affordable and they need to be equitable. So as equally as importantly, what happened in Paris is that it set up a process for tracking and reporting against these targets and timelines and conditions. So all the countries involved set their own targets, make their own decisions on what their contribution to international greenhouse gas reduction is going to be. And then they go to the COPs and they explain to each other how they're doing and what are the challenges and what are the opportunities and where do things stand. The country targets, as I say, are not legally binding. What is legally binding is the commitment to show up at the meeting once a year and present your progress. That's the binding part of it. And the theory of change here obviously is that in annual meetings and tracking and reporting and talking about problems and looking together at new investments, new technologies, and new solutions, this will lead to an increase over time in ambitions and outcomes. So that was Paris. Fast forward 10 years later, Brazil, the Amazon. Emissions reductions are not on track for 1.5. The U.S. has exited or served notice that it is going to exit the Paris Agreement and wasn't formally at the table in Brazil. And meanwhile, China has emerged as the global leader on tech for clean energy. So just a quick timeline, just a note on the U.S. in and out kind of revolving door. I just want to make sure you're aware that it is a bit of a revolving door with the UN and the climate COPs and the framework agreement. I won't go through all of this, but they signed the agreement. They were in the Kyoto Accord 1998, out in 2001, in Paris in 2016, out in 2020, then back in Paris in 2021, out again this year. I think the important point I want to make here is that out doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. didn't have a presence in Belém. They did. There were many states there, cities there, many organizations and U.S. companies. So notwithstanding the current politics around COP meetings, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. continues to be a very significant player in climate and energy strategies and technologies. And speaking of significant players, meet Sonia Guajaro. I don't know if you guys got a chance to meet her when you were there, but she's a Brazilian indigenous leader and Brazil's first ever Minister of Indigenous Peoples. And I love this picture. I think it was taken at COP28 in 2023 in Dubai. Sonia is so tiny compared to the other delegates, but I can assure you she packs a punch. She was one of the leaders, I think, Dave, that helped ensure that COP30 in Brazil attracted the largest indigenous presence and participation in history, over 3,000 attendees at the last count. And Brazil, as Dave and Dar said, really wanted COP. They were going to host a COP. They wanted to design it so it framed attention to the fact that leadership and participation by Indigenous peoples is critical to climate solutions. And by all accounts, they succeeded on that front. The COP30 not only focused just attention on the role of Indigenous peoples, but also, equally importantly, new money and resources on the roles that Indigenous people, forests, and nature can play in climate strategies. And this is a picture of the proceedings at the launch of the Tropical Forest Forever facility during COP30. This is a new global fund that will combine public and private finance to conserve and restore up to 1 billion hectares of tropical forests globally. The facility is starting off with a cash of $8 billion, and the goal is to ramp it up to $125 billion, with direct shares of the payments going directly to Indigenous and local communities for their stewardship. New standards for accountability, transparency, and integrity were also launched, so this can avoid some of the pitfalls that have affected forest carbon trading and offset systems. So this initiative is very much in early days, but I definitely think it's one that this group wants to pay attention to, perhaps get involved with, because I think there's going to be some ideas and relationships emerging from this, even though it's around tropical forests. I think they may also have some application here on temperate forests. So those were areas of agreement, areas of disagreement. Well, the biggest one, of course, was the fact that the final statement from this COP did not contain any reference to fossil fuels, whereas the final statement at COP 28 in Dubai in 2023 did contain a reference to the need to transition away from fossil fuels. So there was a proposal on the table in Brazil to start developing a roadmap for what does transition away from fossil fuels mean. And so it would have contained milestones and dates and all of those good kinds of things that management consultants tend to like. But it became a flashpoint for disagreement around the delegates, and some countries supported it and others didn't. Without going into the details around that, I think it's just safe to conclude that the role of fossil fuels in energy transition will continue to be a focus of debate at future COPs. And as it is here in Canada, that debate will go on. But just a few other areas of agreement that are relevant to the topics you're going to be discussing in the next 2 days. COP put some wind, besides on the role of Indigenous people, COP put wind in the sails of other things you're going to be looking at. There's certainly, you're going to hear about this from other speakers, huge momentum now circling behind electrification, reflecting the fact that the demand for electricity use is rising faster than overall demand for energy use right now in the world. Methane reductions also got a big spotlight in Brazil because they're such a high impact lever. Clean hydrogen, low emissions, ammonia, biofuels, all on the agenda. One of the big wins coming out of Brazil was a shift in focus from being on climate mitigation to climate adaptation for some new mechanisms for international financing and commitments to raise that financing. So that's the difference between focusing on what's causing climate change, right? Like clean technology to reduce emissions versus dealing with the impacts. So the impacts on communities, floods, fires, what is the adaptation? So what does COP30 in Brazil tell us about the future of global coordination and collaboration on climate? Is the glass half empty or is it half full? Well, it's true the world doesn't seem to be in a big mood for collaboration right now. But it's also true that though we're not on track for 1.5 degrees, since Paris, we have made progress in reducing the overall trajectory on the rate of global warming. In 2015, we were heading for an increase of anywhere from 3.7 to 4.8 degrees Celsius. Under current policies, it's now indicated that we're on a track towards an increase of 2.4 degrees Celsius. So the conclusion, Dave, I hope this was your conclusion. The global show will go on, and it'll go on in Turkey next November. So I'm going to shift gears now, slip a few slides so I can stay on your timeline. Let's think global but act local. And let's look at what's happening with BC's climate plan, the Clean BC plan. Now, this is the BC portion of the plan that Canada submits to the climate COPs every year. So let's dig into that. I think many of you will be familiar with this. It was adopted in 2018, and it actually did legally enshrine some targets there that are up there on the screen. And BC is really ahead, I think it's fair to say, without any hubris, that BC is ahead of the game, at least at the global level on some of these strategies and climate. We already got a roadmap. It was released in 2022, and we've started to develop an adaptation strategy as well. But like the rest of the world, we're not on track with some of our targets, and a reset and a course correction is required. So last spring, the government appointed an independent panel to review Clean BC and make some recommendations on the changes and the course corrections that need to occur. And that was led by Maren Smith and Dan Wolnilovich. And they had an extensive consultation. It was a fast process, 100 days, I think, in total, start to finish. They did extensive consultations in the summer, including First Nations organizations, communities, industry, academic across BC. And they tabled their recommendations last week. And they had recommendations about resetting targets, filling gaps. An important recommendation is deeper alignment with DRIPA and regional First Nations and land use planning processes. And basically their point was we need fewer actions, but more focus on what's effective, achievable, and fiscally responsible. I can't go through it all with you today. It's an excellent report. You're not going to agree with all of it. No, nobody will agree with all of it, but it's very thoughtfully done. It's 100 pages, but if you have an hour or two, it's a very good primer on energy in BC and what are our options. But just I want to skip quickly to what are the Clean BC recommendation on targets. So, what did I do? No? Can you fix it? Okay. So what are the BC, the recommendations on targets? I think I accidentally pressed a button here. So it's basically, have you got it back? Okay, good. So targets. Here's their advice, Dan and Marin's advice. Methane is working. Don't fix it. It's driving results. Actually, BC has the best results of methane reduction in Canada, actually meeting global standards on it. We're ahead of the game there. Industrial carbon pricing is working. Strengthen it. Transportation is AWOL. It's missing from the plan right now. Move the 2030 province-wide target, which I think was 40%, to 2035. So more time to achieve that target. Remove sector-specific targets. This was interesting, bit of a shock, to some, don't adopt an oil and gas emissions cap. This was also part of the Canada-Alberta MOU that was announced last week. And revise the target for electric vehicles. They also had a number of recommendations besides targets. How do you measure? This is the part where we all go down the rabbit hole and confuse the general population or the population at large. They said, what about performance indicators? We're too dependent just on GHG emissions as a measure of whether or not we're achieving progress, right? They said count other things besides emissions, include in particular what is being built, the things that are being actually built to grow the economy, cut emissions, strengthen competitiveness, and create jobs. And they had a couple examples of this. So natural gas production in BC is up, but methane is down. BC is now selling more heat pumps than gas furnaces. 225,000 electric vehicles are already on the road, and the low carbon fuel standard is helping to drive the creation of a much larger clean fuel industry here in BC. The elephant in the room, as far as emissions are concerned, LNG expansion. They have a chapter entitled Squaring the Circle. It's definitely worth taking a read at. They recognize that LNG expansion is going ahead in BC, where it has First Nation support, is going to have federal and provincial support. And this is, as they've described it, an economic decision with climate impacts. And it recognizes that the math on LNG is very hard to get to work. LNG expansion is going to raise the bar for government tracking and reporting on impacts and accountability for climate outcomes. And it will require an even faster build out of clean tech and particularly clean power to prevent new emissions from LNG from eliminating progress in other sectors. So, nationally, new federal carbon competitiveness strategy, last track, the Carney government. What are they doing? Well, not exactly clear yet, but there were a couple of glimpses of it in the 2025 November budget. You'll know that the PM likes to tell us that we're at a hinge moment here. We have to have a major, transformation and reposition of the Canadian economy to deal with the disruption that's happening in our trade relationships. They're proposing a massive investment of $11 trillion in public and private capital over the next 5 years to diversify products and markets. There's a commitment to Indigenous leadership and participation, PM spoke yesterday at the large First Nations gathering, the Assembly of First Nations at the national level. It contains the first look at the shifts that the Carney government wants to make on federal climate policy. And it's introducing some new terms: clean and conventional, carbon competitiveness, and cooperative federalism. I think you've probably seen some of this in the media. I won't go into it, but that says 1 million or 1 trillion. It should be 11 trillion investment with climate implications. So it's the new infrastructure, the nation building project lists, critical minerals and LNG, housing, defense. And now we're learning more about the Canada-Alberta MOU. The promising new strategies are going to be released for electricity and nature and for scaling AI and clean tech. So when you wrap all this together into one slide and have very limited skills in PowerPoint, what does it look like? It looks like that, okay? So you got your global. You got your reset going on globally. You got your reset going on locally. You've got reset nationally. And what are the cross-cutting themes here? Which direction is the wind blowing, where there's going to be resources, momentum, support? Where can you bring people together as opposed to divide them? So there's a couple of pretty clear ones that are on the table now. So it's Indigenous leadership and participation across the board at all three levels. Electrification, rapid expansion of demand, load, and build out, right? For clean, affordable, reliable energy generation. And that's the full kit of all the sources that you're going to be looking at today: batteries, renewables, storage grids, electricity and gas integration, geothermal, and the list goes on. Methane, still making the top of the list on a cross-cutting basis. Industrial decarbonization and low carbon fuels really coming up now strongly. Finance, important, adaptations, building, and resilience. These are the areas that are moving at all levels. Closing thoughts. Highly uncertain times, the highest since World War II. Robert can talk about that later, maybe in his presentation. Climate matters, but economic security and sovereignty clearly trumps. It is the priority right now. If security, affordability, reliability suffers as a result of faster GHG emissions, there will be a backlash. We've seen it happen already. It'll continue to happen. Another final thought: Indigenous peoples have more influence on major economic decisions in Canada right now than ever before, which means there's an opportunity to use that influence to secure projects that will work in a good way. And lastly, maybe second to the lastly, the current urgency around attracting private and public capital investment is probably pretty time sensitive. You shouldn't assume it's necessarily going to be there in another 3 to 5 years. Last words: strategies that worked previously may not work today. Thank you.